A lot of us grew up with Harry Potter, and I am no exception. However, I didn't end up actually getting to reading the books until pretty recently. When I was young, I was a little too young for reading them when I first tried, so I only got through like 1 1/3 of a book of Harry Potter. And then I watched the movies, and I loved the movies. And finally, years later, I had a friend who had never been involved with Harry Potter at all, and I got her into watching the movies. And we had a big marathon, and she loved it, and it was great. And then I started to think, you know what? I'm curious. What was really left out? Are the books really better than the movies? Now, I had known a little bit about the information that was cut and stuff because I'm very interested in like Harry Potter lore, so I've watched a lot of videos breaking down, differences between book and movie and things like that. And I've just noticed that it seems like there are so many points that people bring up repeatedly, specific points that are brought up that either seem like, not that big of an issue, not that big of a deal, that was changed, or it seemed to them like it was a big issue. But when I went through these books, I was like, you know what? That actually makes sense that it was cut. Now, full disclaimer here, I don't have the time to just sit down and read the books, so I decided to listen to audiobooks so I could multitask. And by audiobook, I mean I didn't want to pay for a subscription to somewhere or anything, so I listened to people reading it out loud. So I also got some interesting insight with that person's commentary on reading the book for the first time out loud. But more on that later. So this really got me thinking, though, why is it that there are so many fans who say the books are so much better than the movies, and some even go so far as to say that the movies are good movies but bad adaptations? Are they really? Is that really a reasonable take to have, considering the difference between the mediums? Now, a little context for me as well. I have a slight background in film, that's a weird way to phrase it, but whatever. I went to film school. I went to film school as a directing student, and then I ended up having to learn a lot about writing. I had to direct a lot of short films that I had written myself, and then after school, I decided to just, be all in on the writing, and I've written a lot of scripts since. So, that was a great choice for me to go for directing and then switch over to writing. I love both, but whatever. Also, sorry if you hear weird noises in the background, my dogs and cats are in here with me. So what do I want to really look at here? I want to look at what are these specific things that people constantly bring up about why the books are better than the movies. What details are they saying were left out that shouldn't have been? What changes were made that were actually better in the movies than in the books? And with this new Harry Potter series that is supposedly being made, will fans actually be satisfied with that, or are they likely to run into just as many problems with the series as they do with the movies? So it's probably going to be pretty important to lay a little foundation work here about screenwriting, so that way we're all on the same page. So when it comes to screenwriting, there's a very specific format that you have to follow for the actual writing itself. You're not necessarily going to see that watching the movie, obviously, because you're not reading the script, but it does have a very big impact on the production. You have to write out following this specific formula, so that way you can anticipate exactly how long everything will be. The general rule of thumb is that if you follow the proper formatting for a script, 1 page will equal 1 minute of screen time. And that's not necessarily exact 1-to-1, but it's pretty close. So you can kind of get an idea of pacing as well as just like for the production standpoint, how long is this movie? So, if you have a 2-hour movie, you're looking at 120 pages of a script. If you start to go over 120 pages, that's really when you start to prune a little bit. And then if you're only hitting 90, that's when you'll have to start thinking, okay, do we need to add some stuff here? So formatting does matter. It's also very important to know that when you're writing, you're only going to be looking at what is seen and heard. You are never including anything more in the script than the seen and heard. The only exception would be adding in like character ages and stuff. And that's just more so for casting, so that way they know. But obviously, when you're watching the movie, what are you seeing? You're seeing the visuals, you are only hearing the sounds, and those are the only 2 senses that a movie can use, or a TV show or anything like that. So we're only using what is seen and heard, and we have to follow the very specific format, so that way 1 page equals about 1 minute of screen time. So I'm sure you can imagine that if you were to look at the books and you were to look at how many pages there are, you would say, wow, this would be an incredibly long movie if we were doing it 1-to-1. And it would be, but the thing is, the format of writing prose versus a script, it's going to be very different. there are sections in the book where you can have actions that are described in literally one sentence that just takes you like 1 second to read, that will take several seconds, if not like a minute, to actually go through and show in a movie. So of course there will be things that just don't translate one-to-one. So there may be some pages of the book where if you're writing that out in a script, realistically, you're going to be taking 10 pages. And so you'll have 10 minutes for that one book page, or you may only need half a script page to cover an entire page from the book. It will depend a little bit, but generally I would say based off of what I've just kind of gleaned from the books, I haven't necessarily tried writing it out just to see to get like an actual average, but I would say anticipate that each page of the book is probably going to be more than 1 page of script. So now you can see why it was so important to prune so much from the books to get to a reasonable watch time for the movies, and why Deathly Hallows was split into 2, because there's just so much to go over. Now, something else that's really important to take into consideration when comparing the books and the movies, and mostly when tempering your expectations of what should have been in the movies from the book, you also have to take into consideration how fast do you read. Now, I know this may sound a little like, well, duh, obviously reading versus watching is going to be different, but I've talked to several people about this to just kind of get an idea of, do they think that the way they read and how fast they read influences how they think things will translate on screen? And usually they say, yeah. When they stop and think about it, they agree. So like I said, I was listening to the audiobooks, and when this one person that I was watching who was reading, he was trying to do the characters and stuff, and sure, he had a little bit of his own commentary, but for the most part it was just reading, and even then it was hours and hours and hours and hours for each book. So when I was doing that marathon with my friend, and we were about to watch Prisoner of Azkaban, I think it was, and it was late at night, and she was like, you know what, let's just watch all of them. Let's just watch all of them in a row. I'm in such a Harry Potter mood. Let's just go. Let's do all of them at once. I was like, oh my goodness, no, we are not watching all of them at once. She said, well, why not? How many are there? How long is it? And then I looked it up, and I don't remember the exact number, but I remember that I was like, okay, we would be watching for literally a day, nonstop. And she was like, oh, yeah, we're not finishing the movies tonight. I was like, yeah, no, we're breaking it up into several days. So even with how much was pruned, there is a ton of movie time when you pull the whole series together. But yeah, it was insane. But anyway, so even just reading it out loud, that takes so long. For some of the longer books, it ended up taking just about as much time to read the book when you pulled all the different sessions together as it would have to watch the entire movie series. Now, when the Half-Blood Prince, I believe it was, came out, my mom was so excited, and I remember that she literally went into the room and was just like, okay, your dad's taking care of you guys for now. I am sitting in here, no one is disturbing me, I am finishing the book. And then she, went in there in the afternoon and came out crying, and I didn't know why, and I figured out eventually with the ending of the book, but it literally took my mom an afternoon and a bit into the evening to read Half-Blood Prince. And that's just not really how it's going to be when you're doing that on screen. Because if you're doing a one-to-one of that book onto screen, it's going to take longer than just a handful of hours. It's going to take a really, 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 really long time. So it's a weird subconscious thing, and I've definitely noticed it happening in my mind too when I'm reading books, that it's very easy to just kind of flash through the images in our brain and have our brains interpret it in a way that makes sense. But if we were to genuinely see it flash that much, that fast on screen, holy cow, that would be you would have to have flash warning, strobe warning, all of that. We would all be getting dizzy with seeing it go on screen. Unless, of course, you're a slightly slower reader, in which case, hey, maybe you've got it at exactly the right pace as it would be on screen, in which case, good for you then. But no matter how fast or slow or whatever you're reading, it's not usually, at least, going to match the pace it'll be to actually see the thing happening on screen. So those are just some important foundations that I wanted to lay about screenwriting, so that way we could kind of be on the same page about the differences between writing prose versus writing a screenplay versus reading versus seeing. Okay, so let's talk about some of the specific things that I hear are frequently talked about differences between the books and movies that made the books superior and made the movies not so great adaptations. Now, in all honesty, a lot of these complaints come from Goblet of Fire. Now, it was kind of surprising to me when I was growing up that, my favorite of the movies was Goblet of Fire, and I kind of figured, like, okay, yeah, a lot of people probably like this. I even watched a YouTuber who was doing, watching a Harry Potter marathon all throughout and stuff, and, didn't have any knowledge of the books before or anything, and he was all like, wow, this is a really good movie, like, this has got to be, like, one of the top ones, like, this has got to be the peak Harry Potter, like, this has got to be the favorite among the fandom. And then was very surprised later on and addressed it later when he was like, I am so shocked that this actually is commonly considered the worst of the Harry Potter movies, that this one is usually one of the least favorites, if not the least favorite of a lot of people. And when I've watched YouTubers who know a lot about the books and do a lot of breakdowns of the differences between the books and movies and going over the lore that was not included in either one and things like that, usually they end up throwing a lot of shade at Goblet of Fire. And then my friend, when we were doing the marathon, she really liked Goblet of Fire. It didn't end up being her favorite, but she liked it quite a lot. And then I was like, you know what, this is actually not really commonly one of the most liked ones. And she was like, really? You're serious? And then I was talking to a different friend about this, and he had read the books and stuff, but it had been a little while, and I was just talking about Harry Potter and the whole differences between book and movie, really when I started having the idea for this video, and I was like, it's just interesting that, like, Goblet of Fire, because at that point that was the book that I was just finished for my audiobook thing, and I was like, okay, it's really, like, the most differences between the movie and book I've seen of any of them so far, probably because it was the biggest book at that point. And I was like, I get why so many people are like, there's so many things that were left out of the movie, so they felt like the book had to be better. But I was like, you know what, I gotta be honest, I actually prefer the movie to the book, which I know may be a blasphemous thing to say among Harry Potter fans, but it's true. And I was like, and so I was telling him that, and I was just like, it's really surprising that a lot of people, really don't like that movie then. And he was like, really? That one's actually one of the least favorites? And I was like, oh yeah, it's so common when you see people talking about Harry Potter, especially people who know a lot about the books, say that one is their least favorite. And usually when they try to explain it, they end up saying something along the lines of, it's just, there's so much from the book that was left out of the movie. So yeah, I know a lot of you probably already clicked off if you're Harry Potter fans and stuff, and you're like, oh no, you like Goblet of Fire, and you actually prefer the movie to the book, but I do. And look, here's the thing. A lot of the specifics of what people feel should have been included in the movie that was in the books, that they just feel snubbed by, a lot of that comes from Goblet of Fire. Spew and Winky are two of the most common examples I have seen. Again, aside from the whole Harry Ginny thing, which, again, understandable, that one didn't translate. I don't know why they could have had that translate well in the movies, and they didn't, but that's a whole other thing there. So, when it comes to Spew and Winky, why were they cut? Couldn't they have just been included? Well, in all honesty, I don't really think it would have been smart. So, Spew, it's a fun world-building thing, and that's cool, and it gives a little bit more character to Hermione, but not any more than a lot of other things, so Hermione wouldn't have been a drastically different character if that had been included. And then, when it comes to Winky, well, a lot of the stuff with her just needed to be cut. You really don't want to switch to going to a bunch of different locations if you don't have to. Now, usually people would say you don't want to have a bunch of different locations because you don't want to have to pay to have a bunch of different sets and pay to have, company moves and pay to have, more filming time and whatever. And yeah, generally studios don't want to do that, but also that gets so incredibly jarring. You want to spend as much time in a location as you can before you switch. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't want to ever switch locations or anything like that, but it is incredibly jarring to just boom, 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 switch, 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 switch. It'll feel more like a montage than it will a natural flow, especially if these aren't necessarily connected scenes. It's very different if you have, say, a scene where the kids are, in a classroom, and then they're walking out, and they're walking down the steps and stuff, and then they're, having a conversation that the camera's following, and it's following all the way out of the classroom, in the hallways, this and that, and then they're talking about going to Hagrid's, and then we see them, going down the hill, and then into Hagrid's hut. That makes sense. But if we chop that up anymore, where, say, we inserted them going into another place in between there, it might feel a little weird. Or if we, didn't have that flow going from the classroom through the hallway and everything like that and didn't follow them, it would feel a little jumpy. Say we had a classroom talk and say it was supposed to take place during the class and not at the very end of class as they were getting out. If it happened during the class, then we see during the class, and then we cut. And then we see after class them in the hallway talking a little bit, and then we cut. And then we see them out in front of Hagrid's, walking to it, conversation, and then we cut to them being in Hagrid's hut. Like, this isn't necessarily the best example, but I'm just trying to come up with something. I probably should have taken notes on the books and stuff to actually do direct comparisons, but regardless, hopefully that kind of gets the idea that it gets choppy. So for Winky, a lot of the stuff going on with her was like happening in the Hogwarts kitchen, which would that have been fun to see? Yeah, but here's the thing, they ended up having to condense what was going on with Sirius because, well, trying to take time to have them go off to Hogsmeade several times and then go and branch off and walk around this long place to get away from the town, go up the mountains into the cave and stuff, all of that, to then have a conversation. Just a long conversation where you see Sirius eating chicken wings and throwing them to Buckbeak and stuff. Like, yeah, could it have been fun? Sure. Would it have ruined the pacing? 100%. There is no way to naturally squeeze that in without making it really awkward and choppy. So even if they wanted to include it, it probably just didn't fit. So then if we don't need to have them be with Sirius in person, and we're only going to be talking in the fire, well, you don't really need to have them go down to the kitchen to get the food. And you don't necessarily need Spew, because that's kind of this other thing that's going on with Hermione. That's a side quest that's, not really directly related to the main story. You, at the end of the day, don't need Hermione to have Spew in order to have Voldemort come back. That's kind of the big ending of the movie. So it doesn't actually contribute to the main story at all in that movie. It really doesn't. And at the end of the day, it really wasn't needed for the rest of the story either. So Spew can be cut. Would it have been cool to have a little Easter egg or something? Yeah, sure, you could throw in a little Easter egg, but anything that makes people wonder, okay, what the heck is Spew? And like, why is Spew? What Spew is a distracting name, so like, it's meant to be that way. It's meant to be a big joke and stuff. It's a running gag, but at that point, then, if you're going to have too much attention called to it, you need to explain it, because anyone who doesn't know is going to be like, okay, what the heck is going on? And anyone who's read books will probably also want you to explain, hey, what's going on with Spew? You'll don't want to see what's going on with it. So it just makes more sense to cut it. So then we have two things where they would be detracting from the story, throwing off the pacing, and we just don't need those scenes. We can condense it in other stuff, or it's just information that isn't actually at the core of the story. So then we don't need to go down into the kitchens. So when are we going to see Winky? Well, we're not really going to see her that much. We would only see her at the very beginning and the very end. And then that's going to end up dragging out the opening scene with the Quidditch World Cup and all of that. If we have to go through Winky and not have it be, okay, we're going in, we're seeing Quidditch, and then we're seeing the Death Eaters, and then we're getting out, and then we're seeing somebody set off the Dark Mark, and then there we go. All of a sudden now we're just dragging that out drastically if we have to include Winky. And then for the finale, well, at the end of the day, it explains how things happened in the more complicated version of the story in the books. But if we're simplifying and we're taking out a lot of the different little details that are just kind of extraneous, then we don't need it in the movie. So then the thing with Winky is she becomes obsolete. She's not needed. She would be an entirely new character that would be brought in to do nothing. And that would be incredibly distracting if all of a sudden it's like, okay, we're dealing with the Triwizard Tournament, Harry's trying to figure out, how not to, drown underwater for an hour, and then there's just suddenly a crying house elf. It wouldn't make sense. So as much as Winky was kind of fun in the books, she just wasn't needed. Spew wasn't needed. Now, one of the things that it was really bugging me in the book that I think was really the key thing that made me actually like the movie more for Goblet of Fire is the Triwizard Tournament was nearly obsolete in the book. Like, it was so critical to the core story of, again, what is the final outcome, what is the, purpose of that book was to bring Voldemort back. But there's hardly any Triwizard Tournament. Like, there really is almost nothing. I then was like, by the time we got to the second challenge, and then they were saying, okay, now we'll get to a third challenge at some point down the line and stuff. I was just like, why in the world was McGonagall okay with Cedric and Harry not having to take their exams for the Triwizard Tournament. They are hardly doing anything for this tournament at all. Like, it's so obsolete. It's not, like, they could have done their exams reasonably. They really could have. Like, even Quidditch, it really does seem like, okay, that probably could have been going on too just fine. Like, it did make sense that, like, everything just seemed to change and alter for the Triwizard Tournament when it was, like, every once in a while maybe we'll remember it. And for the most part, most of the book, if you look at how much actually has to do directly with the Triwizard Tournament versus everything else, the ratio is just astonishing. Like, really, there's hardly any tournament. And so the pacing for the book felt so off for me, because I was like, why in the world is this the Triwizard Tournament, this thing that, like, granted, I went into it knowing that it was something that was going to be really important, but I was just like, gosh, this almost feels like, if you don't know the ending, the Triwizard Tournament is the thing that should be cut, and Spew should be the thing that's going on. But it ends up being the other way around. The tournament is the thing that's actually critically important to the story, and Spew isn't. So I really do, I think is just the efficiency of the movie is, I think, really what made me like that more. Just the book ended up, like, I like that there's time to explore the characters and the world building and the details and the relationships and everything, but my goodness, do I hate the pacing of that book. Like, why in the world was the Triwizard Tournament made out to be this big, important thing that would take up, like, the champion's entire year almost, and Harry spent maybe, like, a few days out of the school year actually thinking about it, actually doing anything with it? So, anyway, I think that at the end of the day, the movie really does do a better job with the pacing. Yes, there was a lot that was cut, but when you look at the book and you figure, okay, how much is actually going to directly tie into the finale and how the book ends, what is critical to the story. Most of Goblet of Fire, the book, is fluff. It's stuff that is world building, it's fun extra detail, it's not the core story. So of course Goblet of Fire is going to have some of the biggest differences. At the end of the day, most of the book just had to be cut, and reasonably so. I know that'll probably make a lot of people angry, but I gotta be honest, it's just when you look at it from an objective point of view, when it comes to the writing and what actually directly correlates to the end result, you really don't need most of what's in the book. And then the changes that were made because, well, you need to kind of make it more efficient. You don't want to necessarily have choppy, jump here to this location, jump to the kitchens, jump to this, jump to that. You want to have as few locations and as condensed a character list as you possibly can, because when it comes to the visuals and not necessarily getting a little explanation of who each character is because the writer's just telling you those things, it just gets so choppy and honestly overwhelming to try and include all of that in a movie. So there are obviously a lot of differences between the movies and books, and I'm not going to go over every single detail. There are channels who literally will make an entire, very long video dedicated to just running through a list of the differences between books and movies. So yeah, I'm not going to even attempt to go through and explain why each of these changes were made. So I hope that just kind of explaining why Winky was cut, why Spew was cut, why things were changed so much from book to movie in Goblet of Fire, hopefully that helps just kind of explain not necessarily every single detail, but just the thought process behind it, the logical reasoning behind why certain things are changed or not changed, why characters are cut or condensed or whatever. Hopefully you can just like take that and apply it to any of the details that were changed that bother you, and that can kind of explain it. Again, Harry, Ginny, I get that one not necessarily covered in this, but you know, that hopefully it gets the idea across. So now let's think, okay, what are the good differences between movie and book that really allowed the movie to have something better than the book, maybe? So aside from like pacing of Goblet of Fire, which, yeah, that one just, I was very surprised with the book on that one. But Severus Snape is probably the biggest example of a really positive change that a lot of people like going from book to movie. A lot of people love movie Snape, and a lot of people hate book Snape. And there is a pretty big difference between them. Now, I've heard some people say that it's just the Alan Rickman effect and stuff, and yeah, sure, I can absolutely believe that plays into it. But also, for the movies, you don't necessarily get as much time with Snape, because there's just a little bit less time being used in the movies than in the books in general. So it really made sense that they would want to alter things just a little bit in order to help the audience kind of understand this dichotomy with Snape and understand why he really became the way he was and why he ended up becoming a spy for Dumbledore. Now, they could have tried to make it closer to book Snape and stuff, and so part of the reason why they changed it could have been, a little bit of just a creative decision on their part, but I really do see how it just is more efficient for the movie to give you little crumbs to help you understand that shift later, so that way when it happens, you are able to accept it a lot quicker than you would be in the books. Because, well, again, we're just running on a quicker time. We have to condense it. We have to get through things a little bit quicker. So in the end, changing it to, have instead of this whole big thing of, in Prisoner of Azkaban of Snape, explaining the pranks and knocking everyone out and doing, making magical gurneys appear and stuff like that, to have him, be knocked out, but then, have, when Lupin is werewolf, goes into the werewolf form, Snape comes out and puts himself in front of the children and stuff. That is just a little thing, a little visual thing they were able to change in the movies that not only helped with the pacing and the dramatic effect of everything, but it also just helped us build up Snape's character to be a little softer, a little bit more of a reluctant hero, or even a reluctant bad guy, maybe. So this, at the end of the day, ended up being, honestly, a pretty positive change. It's a very different version of Snape, but again, one that a lot of people really like, and for good reason. They made him more likable. But in all honesty, I think a good portion of why that needed to be done in the movies versus the book is just with the condensed storytelling. Sometimes you need those sort of cheat codes. We usually call it save the cat for screenwriting, where it comes from just a joke about, if you want your character to be likable, you have them literally save a cat and stuff. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard that expression probably, but it made sense for the movie to use that save the cat cheat code for Snape to just get us on board with him a little bit quicker. So sometimes this whole trimming down on time, having more efficient storytelling for a movie does actually come in handy and can make improvements from the book. So another advantage that the movies have over the books is that sometimes you can just make moments more impactful using the medium of movies versus books. So when I was listening to the person reading, we're going to go back to Goblet of Fire, and they had the scene in the graveyard with Cedric. When they read that happening, they just kind of read the sentence and then kept reading it and then went, wait a second, and went back. But obviously it plays out much different in the movie. And so you can use, the visual language of film, you can use how long you stay on a shot or not, you can use the sound and all of that to your advantage. So I will be honest here, there are just some advantages to having, something in the medium of a film versus writing. Sometimes things just are a little bit stronger in one versus the other. And it's not to say that one is better than the other, it's just that there's a reason why they are different mediums. And so there are some just inherent advantages with making something in a film versus in writing. And I know that doesn't necessarily translate as much to the whole book versus movie difference in a lot of these conversations, but I do think it is important to bring up that there just is a difference between the mediums and what you can do, how certain things can come across, how much control you have in the way people are perceiving things in a movie versus a book. I've heard some other people talking about Dumbledore's scene with Snape at the end of Half-Blood Prince and how they perceived him saying please in the book versus in the movie, and how they're like, oh, in the movie, I fully get the story now, but in the book, I did not get that. And so, there are still ways that you can try to, get the certain pacing or the certain tone or whatever across in the writing, but there are just differences. That's, again, just why they are different mediums. So I do want to just point out that there are just some ways that the movies are going to be different from the books just in terms of them being movies, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a disadvantage. It doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, the timing being condensed is a disadvantage. Like I said with Snape, sometimes you can actually make that an advantage depending on how you approach it, but also just the nature of the medium of film can have some advantages that bring something to life in a way that the books just don't necessarily do as well. So like I said before, there are so many differences between the books and movies in terms of details and stuff, and there are people who make really long, detailed videos going over every single detail and difference. Now, I don't necessarily want to do that, so if you have any specific details or things that you would like to know my thoughts on or anything like that, you can feel free to leave a comment, but otherwise I'm just probably going to leave it at the examples that I gave for right now, because like I said, just there are so many differences. So I want to talk a little bit more now about the potential show, and I'm saying potential just because like I'm very open to the idea that this show might end up getting canceled, because I'm not sure exactly who's going to want it or who won't, especially after the whole Percy Jackson thing has been going on. But anyhow, so with the show, I have heard a lot of people saying that like it would be incredibly hard to see a different cast in the roles, but they do want to see all of the things that were in the books come to life in the show because they were cut from the movie. Now, here's the thing. Because of that nature of writing a script, I don't know that everything people want to see from the books will actually translate into the show. So, one of the big things that really does still count for shows and movies all the same is that whole, aside from the structure of the script thing, yeah, that counts, but you probably have more time in a show versus in a movie, obviously, so that's less of a direct concern here. But quite frankly, some things are just not going to translate well to screen at all, and that will count for a show and a movie, which is why they weren't in the movie and probably won't make it into the show. So things being choppy and being quick, things that can, be gone through in writing really fast in your mind, can process it at whatever speed it wants to, depending on how you're reading, that won't always translate to the screen. Dialogue is a huge example of this. Goblet of Fire is so dialogue heavy at the end of the book. Now, I honestly thought watching the movie even, it's pretty dialogue heavy, which isn't always a bad thing. And like, it makes sense for, who's talking and why. Voldemort wants to hear himself speak, he wants to gloat and everything, and then the truth serum obviously is making Barty Crouch Jr. just spill all the beans. But my goodness, in the book, I was like, wow, this, like, it's the same reasons for why they're speaking, but it is just going into so much detail for so long in just a dialogue throw-up, basically. And that works well enough in the writing, but if you were to try and show a scene with that would not work out. People would get so bored so fast to just have a bunch of people standing around talking, and especially if it's just one person talking and everyone else is listening. And the truth is when I was looking at a lot of these different scenes, even going into Order of the Phoenix, where they were at their meeting and like Molly and Sirius were fighting about to tell Harry or not to tell Harry, or even the courtroom where Fudge and Dumbledore are debating back and forth, I was just like, you know what, if I were to translate this to screen, it would seem really tedious, and the remedy would be to trim it up, shorten it. There are so many things that are repetitive about this dialogue, so it needs to be trimmed, it needs to be cleaned, because people don't necessarily want to sit through just seeing two people go back and forth and say the same thing, back and forth, 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 before someone finally just stops talking. And for the exposition dumps, that's just not going to work on screen. It won't. It's very different when you're reading it, because then you're probably envisioning what's going on. You're imagining it a little bit. When he's talking about what happened to, is her name Bertha Jorkins? I think. I don't know. I'm not good with names, but anyway, when, Voldemort was going on and on about what happened with her and all of that and stuff, like, you were probably reading that and then imagining it. Even listening to it, I was imagining that a little bit. I wasn't necessarily imagining Voldemort just standing there talking to everyone. But if you're showing things, you have to, show what's going on. So you're either going to be showing the talking or you're going to be showing flashbacks, which can be okay, but it also, you have to be careful because it can come off as really awkward and cheesy. So it's a little bit difficult trying to translate that into a visual medium. It's just such a long chunk of dialogue. And again, I was listening to someone speaking this, and they were even talking about it and saying, holy cow, that Voldemort just likes to talk and talk and talk, and then, oh my goodness, Barty Crouch Jr. likes to talk and talk, and Voldemort and Dumbledore, and everyone's just talk to talk to talk to talk. And like, yeah, it dragged the ending of the book out so much. And I get that there was a lot to cover, a lot of details, which is why sometimes trimming down those details so we don't need those huge exposition dumps, that matters. That can help significantly. So if we need to trim down the dialogue, because that just won't translate well on screen, we might have to trim out some of the information, or we have to explain it at an earlier time, or we have to do flashbacks to try to break up the visual of someone just standing there talking. But then we have to figure out how do we do that in a way that doesn't look cheap and cheesy. So it's not really as simple as just make it a one-to-one. And really that's the key thing with really transferring something into any medium, is you're not going to get a one-to-one. It was made as a book, and so its original form is just book. It's got all of the advantages and disadvantages of writing in book form. It's got the structure of writing in book form. It's not taking into account the advantages and disadvantages of movie form or show form. So while there might be a little bit more time to cover more things in a show versus a movie, I do not anticipate that a series would actually fully satisfy the people who want to see everything from the book in the show. Now, I know it may seem like I'm kind of exaggerating some of the details and people being like, oh, every itty bitty little detail is a big thing that matters, that it differs from the book and stuff, and that'll always play into the comparison and debating whether or not the movies are good adaptations. But it really sometimes does, very frequently. In fact, I have seen so many people go into, huge amounts of detail about whether or not something actually contributed to the book or movie being better just because it was a difference. So sometimes, a lot of times, people do care a lot about those little details. And it's fine to care, but it's also good to temper your expectations about what can actually be translated well into the visual form, because it just won't always work out. So you might end up getting to see Peeves in the show, but you might end up cutting some other details that you maybe really wanted to see. I know when I was, again, listening to this person reading the books when they were at Order of the Phoenix and they were going through the cleaning out of the Black household, there were so many little things where they were like, oh my goodness, that would be so much fun. I hope that is in the movie, because that seems like a hilarious and fun scene. And it was like a fraction of a second in the book, but if you're talking about actually making that work in the visual form, say we're not even taking into consideration the time or cost or anything of filming, we're just going with what works for just the pure structure, say everything production is fine, you got an unlimited budget, all of that. There are some things then that they were talking about, like little gags and jokes that were going on with, Ron getting attacked by this random thing or whatever that came out of a cupboard or whatever, and they were like, oh, that would be so funny, I really want to see that scene in the movie, and it just would take so much more time. If it takes a fraction of a second to just say this happened and then imagine it in your brain as you're reading, it's not going to take a fraction of a second in a show or movie. It's going to take at least a minute. Sometimes those scenes would take several minutes depending on the exact one or exactly how you want to get it across. But again, you can't just really quickly flash these images up on the screen, because that gets incredibly jarring visually for the people watching. So no, not everything that you want from the books will appear in the show if it happens. It's a guarantee not everything will translate, because there are just some things that inherently do not translate from the book to a visual medium well. So on my journey going through the books and the movies, I really have found myself liking the movies a lot more than most of the books. And that's not necessarily to say that I think the books are bad or anything like that. I just find myself appreciating the tighter, more efficient storytelling of the movies. And it's not to say that they're perfect, but in all honesty, I really do think that they are a better adaptation than most people give them credit for. Of course, yes, there are some little things, like, again, Harry and Ginny, that they didn't hit the nail on the head. But in all honesty, when you look at what you are able to do in a movie and how much they were able to accomplish and how much from the books they were able to take and how sometimes they even improved upon them, They really did an amazing job with these. I was challenging myself as I was hearing these books read out loud. Okay, how would I write this as a script? And in all honesty, I don't think it would have been too far off from what they ended up with. They really did a good job. Now, I know a lot of people still do love the movies, even if they think the books are better. And some people will say that, yes, they were great movies and stuff, but there was so much information missing from the books. But when you look at why it was cut, it makes a lot of sense. And so there is going to just, of course, inherently be some differences between the two mediums. They will never be a perfect 1-to-1 ratio. If you write a book from a movie, it's going to be different. It's going to feel like you're adding way too much, or it's going to be a really short book. And if you take the book and change it into a movie, it's going to seem like you're taking away so much. But at the end of the day, what they did with the movies was they took the core story of Harry Potter, the main threads that you absolutely needed, and put those to film. That is honestly an impressive task, and they did a great job at just pulling in the key parts of the story you absolutely needed. And at the end of the day, that was their job. It wasn't their job to take every detail from the books and put them in the movies, because that just wasn't going to work. That wasn't going to happen. They needed to take the core of the story and put it to film. That's what they did. And in all honesty, aside from Harry and Ginny, I really don't think they could have done much better. If you made it this far, thank you for watching the video. I really appreciate it. Feel free to like, subscribe, leave a comment telling me why I'm insane for loving Goblet of Fire, or if you thought anything that I said actually made sense here. If you have any other Harry Potter or anything else type of content that you would like me to cover, you want to hear my thoughts on, please let me know. Thank you so much for watching.